what elements in your background may have played an influence in your becoming a writer? And what would you say is the kind of writer that you have become?
Interesting. So, I mean, as the child of revolutionaries, in a sense, I had the kind of upbringing which was very Pan-African in nature. My father left South Africa to go into exile when he was a very young man, and then I was born in exile, and my sisters were also born in exile. And we grew up in a community of people who were all members of liberation movements. So a very self-selecting group of people who saw themselves both as intellectuals but also as activists, and who were concerned with the African question. So in some ways, if I hadn't become a writer, it would have been a surprise. If one of us in the family had not decided to write, it would have been a bit of a surprise, because I think there was a real commitment to understanding the African condition. That was very much a part of what the conversations were like, you know, the parties and the discussions and all of that stuff, kind of growing up. So in some ways, I think I'm a writer because of my upbringing. Of course, as an African who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s on the continent, outside of South Africa, so in Zambia and then in Kenya, I very much was part of a generation where education was very important. You know, I think for my generation, we were seen as the sort of first cohort of post-independence kids who would really change Africa. I think our parents put a lot of expectation on us, and they were very confident in us. And so as part of that generation, there were a lot of expectations, and those expectations were not necessarily that you would become a writer, but that you would become something very important. So you would become a doctor or a lawyer, someone who would change, you know, the situation of people on the ground, you know, that kind of thing. So I did that first. I did the proper thing first. And then, having worked for a while in the development sector, working on policy in public health, it became clear to me that too many of the stories about our continent were being told through the eyes of other people, and were being told not just through the eyes of other people, but by institutions that profited off of our misery. So the development sector, which is set up, you know, in many ways to make money out of the fact that Africans are poor, and so the fundraising efforts are aimed at pity and all of these things. So it's a machine, it's a manufacturing of this story of Africa, and being part of it as a thinking African who worked very hard not to reproduce those images, I thought the best way to think about this question is from outside of this machinery. And so I resigned and I started writing. I've been writing on a full-time basis for 5 years, but my columns and all of that kind of stuff really took off. And so the book kind of came out of the process of realizing that having a voice that's an independent voice was very important, certainly in South Africa at the time that I started writing.